I'm Sarah Coleman, and at 32 years old, I thought I understood what family meant. I was wrong. For 7 years, I poured $250,000 into keeping my parents and sister afloat, believing that love meant sacrifice, and loyalty meant never saying no. I funded their dreams, paid their bills, and covered their mistakes while they treated me like background noise in my own family story. My sister Amanda was the golden child who could do no wrong, while I was the reliable workhorse expected to solve every crisis without complaint or recognition. But families have breaking points, and mine came crashing down on New Year's Eve, 2024 inches, the most spectacular way imaginable. What happens when the person everyone takes for granted finally stops giving? When the family ATM decides to close for business? When 7 years of suppressed anger explodes in one devastating moment that changes everything forever? Stay with me, because what happened next will shock you as much as it shocked them. Let me take you back to where it began. What would you do if your family disowned you on New Year's Eve, after you'd spent $245,000 keeping them afloat over 7 years? I'm Sarah Coleman, and I'm sitting in my Austin apartment right now looking back at the night that changed everything. New Year's Eve 2024 was supposed to be about fresh starts and new beginnings, but it became the moment my family showed their true colors, and I finally found the courage to walk away from people who saw me as nothing more than a walking ATM. But let me take you back to where it all began, in a ranch-style house in Cedar Park, Texas, where I learned early that love had a price and I was always expected to pay it. I grew up knowing exactly where I stood in the Coleman family hierarchy. I was the reliable one, the achiever, the daughter who never caused trouble. My younger sister Amanda, 6 years my junior, was the shining star who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. The difference in how we were treated wasn't subtle. It was written in every Christmas morning, every report card, every family gathering that followed the same predictable script. I remember one Christmas in particular, when I was 12 and Amanda was 6. She'd just finished first grade, with what could generously be called average performance, struggling with basic reading and math. But that Christmas morning, there, under our artificial tree, sat a brand new pink bicycle with streamers flowing from the handlebars, a wicker basket, and a bell that chimed like music. Mom clapped her hands with pure delight as Amanda squealed and threw her arms around the bike frame. Dad knelt down to adjust the training wheels, his face glowing with the kind of pride I'd been chasing my whole young life. I stood nearby, holding my report card with straight A's across every subject, waiting for someone to notice. Dad glanced over at me, gave my shoulder a quick pat, and said, "Keep it up, kiddo," before turning his full attention back to Amanda's squeals of joy. That was the moment I learned that excellence was expected from me, while mediocrity from Amanda was celebrated like a miracle. Our dad, David Coleman, worked as a shift supervisor at the General Motors plant outside Austin. He wore his navy blue uniform like a badge of honor, coming home each evening, smelling of motor oil and metal shavings, his hands scarred and calloused from decades of honest work. He walked with the confident stride of a man who provided for his family and took pride in steady employment. Our mom, Carol, worked part-time as a receptionist at Dr. Henderson's dental office in town. Her job wasn't glamorous, and she never pretended to love it, but she showed up every morning because the paycheck helped with groceries and Amanda's endless activities. The favoritism wasn't just about Christmas presents. Amanda got the larger bedroom even though she was younger. She wore new clothes from the mall, while mine came from discount racks or hand-me-downs from cousins. At every school event, Dad's voice boomed from the bleachers whenever Amanda's name was called, even if it was just for participation ribbons and activities. She'd quit within months. When I walked across the stage to accept academic awards or honor roll recognition, his applause was polite but distant, like he was clapping for a neighbor's child. I'll never forget the afternoon when I was 10, and Amanda came bouncing through the front door with a math worksheet marked 60% in red ink. Most parents would see that failing grade as cause for concern, maybe extra tutoring or reduced TV time. But Mom looked at that paper, kissed Amanda's forehead, and announced with genuine enthusiasm, "You did your best, sweetie." Let's go get ice cream to celebrate trying so hard. That same week, I had placed first in the regional spelling bee, beating kids from schools across 3 counties. The ribbon sat in my backpack for days because no one asked about the competition I'd been preparing for all month. When I finally mentioned it during dinner, Dad nodded absently and said, "That's nice, honey," before turning to Amanda to ask about her art project. That night, I lay awake listening to the ceiling fan turn lazily above my bed, wondering why my best was never good enough, while Amanda's worst was always cause for celebration. I was learning a lesson that would shape the next 2 decades of my life. I was valued for what I could produce and provide, while Amanda was cherished simply for existing. As we got older, the pattern only deepened. Amanda learned to play into her role perfectly, acting as though praise and attention were her birthright. She interrupted me at the dinner table, and if I objected, Dad would scold me for being too harsh with my sensitive little sister. Mom often said Amanda needed extra encouragement because she was more delicate, more artistic, more in touch with her emotions. I was told I was strong enough to handle things on my own. The truth was, I had no choice but to be strong. Nobody was coming to rescue me or make excuses for my failures. I learned to swallow disappointment, to celebrate my own achievements in private, and to expect nothing, while Amanda learned to expect everything. By the time I was in high school, I'd stopped hoping that a perfect report card or academic award would finally make them see me the way they saw her. But I never stopped trying. Deep down, I believed that someday, if I just achieved enough or gave enough or proved myself worthy enough, they would finally look at me with the same unconditional love they showered on Amanda. I had no idea that this desperate need for their approval would eventually cost me nearly $250,000 and almost destroy my life. Looking back now, I can see how every slight, every dismissal, every moment of being overlooked was building toward the explosion that would come years later on New Year's Eve. The little girl who stood holding straight A's while her sister got celebrated for a pink bicycle was already learning that love in the Coleman family came with conditions, and I was always going to be the one expected to meet them. The year 2016 shattered our family's stability like a sledgehammer through glass. David lost his job at the GM plant when the company downsized, cutting nearly 300 positions despite his 18 years of faithful service. I was finishing my final semester at UT Austin, but I drove home that weekend when Mom called with the news, her voice shaking in a way I'd never heard before. I found Dad sitting in his worn leather recliner, staring at a muted television screen, the remote loose in his calloused hands. His shoulders sagged with a defeat so complete it seemed to pull the life right out of him. The man who'd walked with such pride in his uniform, who'd provided steadily for 2 decades, looked like he'd aged 5 years in 5 days. The silence in that living room was thick enough to choke on. Mom moved around the kitchen like a ghost, opening and closing cabinets without purpose. Her part-time dental receptionist salary suddenly expected to carry what had taken 2 incomes to manage. Within weeks, overdue notices started appearing on the kitchen counter like unwelcome guests that wouldn't leave. What made the crisis worse was watching how my parents handled it. Instead of pulling together as a family, instead of everyone stepping up to help, the same old patterns emerged stronger than ever. Amanda was 19, a sophomore at Austin Community College, but when I suggested she get a part-time job to help with expenses, Mom's reaction was swift and sharp. "She needs to focus on her studies, Mom," snapped, her eyes flashing with protective fury. "You're stronger, Sarah. You can handle working while keeping up your grades." Amanda is more sensitive about these things. More sensitive. That phrase had followed my sister through every challenge in her life, used to excuse her from any real responsibility or hardship. Meanwhile, I was juggling a full course load in software engineering, working 20 hours a week at the campus library, tutoring high school kids in math for extra cash, and picking up weekend shifts at a diner on Guadalupe Street just to cover my textbooks and meal plan. I'll never forget that Christmas of 2016. Money was tighter than it had ever been, but somehow Amanda still got the expensive UGG boots she'd been dropping hints about for months. I watched her unwrap them Christmas morning squealing with delight while Mom and Dad beamed at her reaction. Meanwhile, I'd quietly slipped Mom an envelope containing $500 from my campus jobs money. I'd scraped together by eating ramen for weeks and walking to class instead of taking the bus. Dad hugged Amanda tight and promised they'd figure out a way to get her the matching purse she wanted for her birthday. My envelope of cash disappeared into Mom's purse with a mumbled thank you and a reminder not to mention it to Amanda, because it might make her feel bad about the family's financial situation. Even our neighbor Mrs. Chen noticed the imbalance. The retired teacher lived in the house next door and had a clear view of our front yard from her kitchen window. Years later, she would tell me how she watched me come home that winter break, spending my days off from my campus jobs, shoveling their sidewalk, raking leaves, and fixing the wobbly front steps while Amanda stayed inside, texting friends and watching Netflix. Mrs. Chen watched me carry in bags of groceries I'd bought with my diner tips, watched me spend my Christmas break doing yard work and home repairs, watched me leave each Sunday looking more exhausted than when I'd arrived. She saw Amanda's new clothes and constant deliveries from online shopping, while I wore the same worn-out sneakers through slush and snow. But Mrs. Chen said nothing at the time. She was a polite woman who believed families should work out their own problems, and she couldn't have known that her silence, like everyone else's, was enabling a pattern that would eventually consume my entire adult life. The job loss didn't humble my parents or make them reconsider their treatment of their daughters. If anything, it made them cling more desperately to their illusions about Amanda's specialness. She became even more protected, more coddled, while I became even more responsible for everyone else's comfort and stability. Dad spent his days sending out resumes and going to job interviews, but his pride was wounded in a way that made him bitter and angry. He snapped at customer service representatives on the phone, complained constantly about younger workers taking jobs from experienced men, and retreated deeper into the recliner where he watched Fox News and nursed his resentments. Mom tried to pick up extra hours at the dental office, but Dr. Henderson could only offer so much work to a part-time receptionist. She came home each evening looking worn down, her cheerful demeanor reserved entirely for Amanda's needs and problems, while treating my visits home like business meetings where we discussed bills and logistics. The crisis revealed something fundamental about our family dynamics that I was still too young and too hopeful to fully understand. When times got tough, Amanda was still the precious princess who needed protection from harsh realities. I was the workhorse expected to carry whatever burdens needed carrying. Dad was the wounded patriarch whose ego required careful handling. And Mom was the enabler who made sure everyone stayed locked in their assigned roles. That spring, as I prepared for graduation and started job hunting, I told myself that things would be different once I had a real career and could help the family get back on their feet. I had no idea that my success would become their survival strategy, or that my love for them would be weaponized into an obligation that would drain me for the next 7 years. I was still naive enough to believe that families helped each other temporarily during emergencies, and then everyone went back to taking care of themselves. I couldn't see that I was being groomed to become their permanent solution to every problem, their insurance policy, against the consequences of their choices and Amanda's endless failures. Graduation day at UT Austin in May 2017 felt like stepping through a doorway into freedom. I walked across that stage in my cap and gown, clutching my software engineering degree, believing I'd finally earned my independence from the family drama that had shadowed my college years. The starting salary at TechFlow Solutions was $75,000 more money than I'd ever imagined having, and it felt like winning the lottery. After 4 years of ramen noodles and library shifts, I found a modest one-bedroom apartment in South Austin, nothing fancy, but it was mine. The walls were white and bare, the carpet was beige and worn, but I could walk around naked if I wanted to, and nobody would tell me I was being inappropriate or ask me to consider Amanda's feelings. I bought a reliable used Honda Civic from a lot on South Lamar, and for the first time since childhood I felt the sweet taste of making my own choices with my own money. Those first few months were intoxicating. I decorated my apartment with clearance finds from Target, learned to cook actual meals instead of surviving on microwave dinners, and even splurged on premium cable with HBO. I was 24 years old, gainfully employed, and finally free to build the adult life I'd been dreaming about since high school. Then the phone calls started. At first, Mom's calls were casual and sweet, the kind of check-ins any loving mother might make. How was the new job? Did I like living in the city? Had I met any nice young men? But gradually, subtly, the conversations began to shift. She'd mention in passing that the electric bill was higher than expected, or that Dad's unemployment benefits were running out, or that they'd gotten another notice about the mortgage being behind. I should have seen the pattern developing, but I was still operating under the naive belief that families help each other temporarily during rough patches, and then everyone goes back to managing their own lives. I thought Dad would find another job, things would stabilize, and we'd all move forward as independent adults. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening in September. I was sprawled on my second-hand couch, eating takeout Chinese and watching sitcom reruns when my phone rang. Mom's voice was different that night, shaky and small in a way that made my chest tighten with worry. "Sarah, honey," she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "I don't know what we're going to do. The bank called today, and they're going to repossess the car if we don't catch up on payments. Your father is so embarrassed, and Amanda doesn't know how bad things are. I just don't know who else to turn to." I sat there on my apartment floor, surrounded by my own bills and my own responsibilities, feeling that familiar guilt rise in my chest like smoke from a fire I couldn't put out. The car payment was $800. I had that much in my checking account, money I'd been saving for new work clothes and maybe a weekend trip to San Antonio. "I can help with this month," I heard myself saying, the words coming out before my brain could stop them. "Just to get you caught up while Dad looks for work." That single check was like opening a dam. By October, Mom called to say the mortgage company was threatening foreclosure. By November, the utilities were about to be shut off. By December, they needed help with insurance premiums. What started as a temporary assist became a permanent arrangement so gradually that I barely noticed how completely I'd become their financial lifeline. $1,200 for the mortgage, $500 for utilities, $800 for car payments, $300 for insurance. The numbers added up to more than half my take-home pay, but I told myself it was temporary, just until Dad found work, just until things stabilized, just until Amanda graduated and could help out. The irony was that while I was quietly funding their survival, Amanda was living like nothing had changed. She still got spending money for clothes and nights out with friends. She still had her own car, her own phone, her own freedom to focus on school without worrying about adult responsibilities. Meanwhile, I was eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner and walking to work to save gas money. My parents accepted my help with gratitude, but it was the kind of gratitude you show to a utility company for keeping the lights on. Necessary, appreciated, but not particularly remarkable. They never asked how I was managing to cover 2 households on an entry-level salary. They never suggested a timeline for when the help might end. They never acknowledged the magnitude of what I was sacrificing. When I visited home on weekends, which became more frequent as they needed help with maintenance and repairs, Dad would thank me for the mortgage payment in the same breath. He'd complain about younger workers taking good jobs away from experienced men like himself. Mom would hug me goodbye while handing me a grocery list for the next week. Amanda would wave from the couch where she was doing homework, protected from any knowledge of how precarious their situation really was. I started keeping spreadsheets tracking every payment I made to their household. Part of me wanted to understand where my money was going, but another part of me was already building a case file documenting my contribution in a way that felt uncomfortably like collecting evidence for a future trial. By Christmas 2017, I was fully supporting 2 households and telling myself it was temporary. I bought their groceries, paid their bills, and watched Amanda unwrap presents I'd essentially funded while my own savings account stayed empty. I was learning to live on the emotional scraps they threw me, while they saved their real affection and attention for the daughter who contributed nothing but drama and dreams. The girl who'd graduated with honors and landed a great job was disappearing into the role of family ATM, though I was still too hopeful and too guilty to see the trap I'd built around myself. I thought I was helping them get back on their feet. I had no idea I was actually enabling a lifestyle. They had no intention of giving up. While I was quietly bankrolling the family's survival, Amanda embarked on what she called her entrepreneurial journey, though it looked more like an expensive tour through every get-rich-quick scheme she could find online. Each new venture was announced with the breathless excitement of someone who'd discovered the secret to easy money, and each failure was explained away with excuses that somehow made it everyone else's fault but hers. The first disaster came in spring 2018, when Amanda declared that culinary arts was her true calling. She'd been watching Food Network religiously and convinced herself that she had what it took to be the next celebrity chef. The Art Institute of Austin wanted $8,000 for their culinary program money. The family obviously didn't have, but somehow they scraped it together. I suspected my monthly mortgage payments were freeing up other funds, though nobody mentioned that connection directly. Amanda lasted exactly 1 semester before deciding that professional cooking was too demanding and the instructors were too harsh. She came home with stories about mean chefs who yelled too much, and classmates who were too competitive, painting herself as too sensitive and artistic for the brutal world of commercial kitchens. By summer, she discovered her next passion. Food trucks were booming in Austin, and Amanda was convinced she could create the next big street food sensation. She spent weeks designing a concept for Amanda's Kitchen, complete with cute logos and a social media strategy she'd learned from YouTube videos. The startup costs were $15,000 for a used truck and basic equipment money that somehow materialized from the family budget I was supporting. I remember the day they bought the truck, a cheerful yellow vehicle with hand-painted signs advertising fresh, local artisanal comfort food. Dad beamed with pride as he took photos of Amanda standing beside her new business venture, posting them on Facebook with captions about his entrepreneurial daughter following her dreams. The comments poured in from family, friends, and neighbors, all praising Amanda's courage and vision. The truck lasted exactly 4 months. Amanda quickly discovered that running a food business meant getting up at 5 in the morning to prep ingredients, standing in the Texas heat for 8 hours a day, dealing with difficult customers, and handling cash transactions while managing food safety requirements. The romantic vision of being a beloved local chef collided hard with the reality of being a small business owner. When Amanda abandoned the food truck, claiming that the city's permit process was too complicated and the competition was unfair, Mom and Dad spun it as a learning experience. "She's exploring her options," Mom would tell concerned relatives. "She's got such a creative spirit, she needs to find the right outlet." Next came the online boutique selling handmade jewelry. Amanda had watched a few YouTube videos about wire wrapping and convinced herself she could build an empire selling artisan accessories. She needed $3,000 for inventory, packaging supplies, and a website money that once again appeared from the household budget I was funding. She set up shop in the spare bedroom, turning it into what she called her design studio, complete with craft supplies and a ring light for photographing her creations. The boutique lasted 6 months, during which Amanda made perhaps a dozen sales, mostly to relatives who were trying to be supportive. Most of the inventory ended up in her own jewelry box, expensive materials that had been purchased with my mortgage payments and transformed into accessories for Amanda's personal collection. When the business inevitably failed, she blamed the algorithm changes on Etsy and Instagram, claiming that small businesses were being squeezed out by corporate interests. The cryptocurrency phase came next, riding the wave of Bitcoin mania that was sweeping the country. Amanda spent weeks researching blockchain technology and watching YouTube videos from self-proclaimed crypto experts, becoming convinced that digital currency was the future of wealth building. She pressured Dad into investing $5,000 money that should have gone toward home repairs into various altcoins that she was certain would make them all rich. I watched this disaster unfold from my apartment, where I was eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner and walking to work to save gas money. The $5,000 Dad gambled on Amanda's crypto dreams was more than I spent on groceries in an entire year, but it was treated as a reasonable investment in their daughter's financial education rather than the reckless speculation it obviously was. When the crypto market crashed and the $5,000 evaporated, Amanda explained that they'd gotten out too early, that the technology was still evolving, and that real investors thought in terms of decades rather than months. Dad nodded along with her explanations, still proud of his visionary daughter, who was thinking about cutting-edge opportunities, while his other daughter merely worked a boring job in traditional software. Through it all, I sat at their kitchen table during weekend visits, listening to them praise Amanda's entrepreneurial spirit, while completely ignoring the fact that my boring traditional job was paying for their house, their cars, their utilities, and funding Amanda's endless string of expensive experiments. The irony was lost on them completely. My friend Rachel Kim became my sounding board during our monthly wine nights, listening to me vent about the latest Amanda business failure while I paid for everyone's survival. "You realize they're using you right," Rachel would say, her dark eyes sharp with concern. "She's playing entrepreneur with your money while you're working yourself to death." I always defended them, explaining that families help each other, that Dad was still looking for steady work, that Amanda just needed to find her niche. But privately, I was keeping detailed spreadsheets of every payment I made, every business venture I indirectly funded, every dollar that disappeared into the black hole of their financial dysfunction. The pattern was becoming clear even to my willfully blind eyes. Amanda generated excitement and dreams while I generated money and stability. She was celebrated for her vision and creativity while I was taken for granted as the reliable workhorse. She failed upward into new opportunities, while I succeeded into greater obligations and expectations. By 2020, I'd been supporting their household for 3 years, and Amanda had burned through nearly $30,000 of various business ventures, none of which had generated any meaningful income or taught her any lasting lessons about work responsibility or consequences. By late 2024, my career at TechFlow Solutions was finally reaching the moment I'd been working toward for 7 years. Our development team had just delivered a revolutionary fintech platform 3 weeks ahead of schedule, a system that streamlined mobile banking for credit unions across the Southwest. The client feedback was glowing. Industry publications were calling it innovative, and for the first time in my professional life, I felt like I was being recognized for something that mattered. My manager, Jennifer Rodriguez, pulled me aside after our final presentation to the board of directors. Jennifer was one of those women who'd climbed the tech ladder through sheer competence, earning respect in a field that didn't always welcome female leadership, and her approval meant everything to my career trajectory. "Sarah, I've been watching your work on this project, and I'm impressed," she said as we walked back toward the development floor. "There's a senior engineering position opening up in January, and I want you to consider applying. We're talking about a salary bump to $120,000 plus equity options, plus the chance to lead your own team." The opportunity felt surreal. After years of watching my paychecks disappear into my family's financial black hole, the possibility of real financial security dangled in front of me like a lifeline. I could finally build the career I dreamed about in college, finally prove that all those years of sacrifice had been worth something. But even as Jennifer outlined the promotion timeline, I could feel the familiar weight of family obligations pressing down on my shoulders. The stress of managing 2 households was showing up in ways I'd tried to ignore. During crucial client presentations, my phone would buzz with texts from Mom about plumbing emergencies or Amanda's latest crisis. I'd lose my train of thought mid-sentence, fumble through technical explanations, and spend the rest of the meeting wondering if I'd just blown my credibility. The breaking point came during a meeting with potential investors from Dallas. I was presenting our security protocols when my phone started vibrating against the conference table, the buzzing audible in the quiet room. Text after text from Carol about some disaster at the house. I tried to ignore it, but the constant notifications were like nails on a chalkboard, drawing annoyed glances from the investors and a concerned look from Jennifer. After the meeting, Jennifer asked me to stay behind as the conference room emptied. Her expression was kind but serious, the look of a manager who cared about her employees but couldn't afford to let personal problems compromise business results. "Sarah, is everything all right at home?" she asked gently. "I've noticed you seem distracted lately, and today during the presentation you seemed like your mind was somewhere else. I want to promote you, but I need to know you can handle the increased responsibility." I forced a smile and lied through my teeth, telling her everything was fine, just some minor family stuff that wouldn't interfere with work. But we both knew that wasn't true. The constant drain of supporting my family was affecting my performance at the exact moment when I needed to be at my professional best. I was sabotaging my own future to enable their dysfunction, and everyone could see it except me. Meanwhile, 68-year-old Mrs. Chen next door had been conducting her own quiet investigation into the Coleman family dynamics. She'd lived in that same house for 30 years, raised 4 children of her own, and taught elementary school long enough to recognize dysfunction when she saw it. From her kitchen window, she had a perfect view of our family's weekend routines, and what she observed disturbed her more each month. Mrs. Chen watched me arrive every Saturday morning with bags of groceries from H-E-B, watched me spend my weekends doing yard work and home maintenance, while Amanda came and went in new clothes carrying shopping bags. She saw the constant parade of delivery trucks bringing packages to the house, noticed that Amanda's car always looked freshly detailed, while mine was showing wear from the long drives between Austin and Cedar Park. What bothered Mrs. Chen most was watching my parents' behavior during these visits. She'd see Dad emerge from the house to greet me with the enthusiasm of someone welcoming a repair service, pointing out problems that needed fixing rather than showing genuine affection for his daughter. She watched Mom hand me grocery lists and honey-do lists like I was hired help rather than family. Mrs. Chen had raised 4 children through lean times and good times, and she knew what healthy family support looked like. This wasn't it, but she was from a generation that believed in minding your own business, so she kept her observations to herself while watching a young woman slowly drain herself dry for people who treated her generosity like an entitlement. The irony wasn't lost on me that my professional success was finally within reach at the exact moment when my family obligations were threatening to destroy it. I was 29 years old, finally hitting my stride in a competitive industry, finally earning the respect of colleagues and supervisors who saw my potential. But I was also spending my evenings managing their crises, my weekends doing their maintenance, and my mental energy worrying about problems I hadn't created but somehow felt responsible for solving. The promotion Jennifer was offering represented everything I'd worked for since college, but accepting it would mean longer hours, more travel, greater responsibility. How could I handle a senior position when I was already stretched thin managing their emergencies? How could I lead a team when I couldn't even manage my own boundaries with my family? As I sat in my Austin apartment that evening, staring at the spreadsheet that tracked 7 years of payments to their household, I felt trapped between 2 impossible choices. I could pursue the career I'd trained for and dreamed about, risking their disappointment and guilt trips about abandoning family when they needed me most. Or I could stay in my current role, safe and manageable, continuing to fund their lifestyle while my own potential withered away. What I couldn't see yet was that Mrs. Chen's silent observations would eventually become the testimony that validated everything I'd experienced, and that Jennifer's promotion would still be waiting for me when I finally found the courage to choose my own future over their endless needs. 3 days before New Year's Eve 2024, Amanda walked into Sunday dinner at the Cedar Park house and dropped a bomb that shattered what little stability our family had left. We were sitting around the familiar kitchen table, The same one where I'd done homework as a child while Amanda got help with projects I could have finished in my sleep. When my sister cleared her throat with the dramatic flair she'd perfected over 26 years. "I need to tell y'all something," she said, her voice wavering between confession and defiance. "I'm in some trouble with credit cards." The words hung in the air like smoke from a grease fire. Dad set down his fork, his face already tensing with the look he got when dealing with problems he couldn't fix with his hands. Mom's mouth opened slightly the way it did when she was processing information that didn't fit her carefully constructed reality. "How much trouble?" Dad asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would be worse than anything he wanted to hear. Amanda twisted her hands in her lap, suddenly looking younger than her years. $18,000 across 4 cards. "The minimum payments are killing me and the interest keeps growing. I've been trying to manage it on my own, but the collectors are calling every day now." The number hit me like a physical blow. $18,000. That was more than half my annual contribution to their household money. Amanda had somehow spent on God knows what while I was eating peanut butter sandwiches and walking to work to save gas money. But the revelation got worse. As Amanda continued her confession, tears starting to streak down her cheeks, she admitted that she'd used my name and address on some of the applications. She'd assumed that if things got really bad, I would help her figure it out, so she'd listed me as a reference and used our family address to make herself look more stable to lenders. "You used my information?" I asked, my voice carefully controlled even as my blood pressure spiked. "Amanda, do you understand that you could have damaged my credit score? My security clearance at work requires clean financial records." She looked genuinely surprised by my concern, as if the idea that her actions might have consequences for me had never occurred to her. "I just thought we're family. I didn't think it would be a big deal." Mom immediately went into protective mode, her voice taking on the sharp edge it always had when anyone criticized her baby girl. "She was just trying to get her life started, Sarah. Everyone makes mistakes when they're young." Young, I wanted to scream. She's 26 years old, not 16. But I bit my tongue and tried to focus on the practical problems. How had this happened? How had someone with a retail job at a sporting goods store managed to get approved for $18,000 in credit? The answer, when it came out, made my stomach turn. Amanda had inflated her income on the applications, claiming she made twice what she actually earned. She'd listed expensive purchases as business investments for her various failed ventures. She'd been making minimum payments by borrowing from friends, doing odd jobs, and occasionally selling items online, but the debt had grown faster than her ability to manage it. Dad's face was gray with worry as the full scope of the crisis became clear. The debt collectors weren't just calling Amanda. They were calling the house, asking for her at the address she'd used on the applications. If they pursued legal action, it could affect the family's already fragile financial situation. "We need your help," Mom said quietly, her words aimed directly at me like arrows finding their target. "You're the only one with good credit and a stable income. If you could co-sign a consolidation loan, we could get Amanda out of this mess and protect the whole family." I stared across the table at my sister, who was crying prettily into a tissue, while our parents looked at me with the same expectant expression they'd worn when asking me to cover the mortgage, the utilities, the car payments, and everything else that had kept their world spinning for 7 years. They wanted me to guarantee another $18,000 for Amanda's shopping addiction, on top of the $35,000 I was already providing annually. The math was simple and devastating. 7 years of support totaling $245,000. Plus, they now expected me to put my own financial security on the line for debts Amanda had accumulated while I was funding her parents' lifestyle and working overtime to advance my own career. "I need some time to think about this," I said finally, my voice steadier than I felt. "This isn't a small request, and I need to understand all the implications before I make any commitments." Amanda's tears intensified, and Mom's expression shifted to the disappointed look I'd seen countless times when I'd failed to immediately solve whatever crisis they'd created. But for once, I didn't cave to the emotional manipulation. I'd learned enough about finance and legal liability to know that co-signing loans was dangerous, especially for someone with Amanda's track record of financial irresponsibility. As I drove back to Austin that evening, my mind was spinning with calculations and concerns. The promotion Jennifer had mentioned would mean longer hours and greater responsibilities. Could I handle a senior position while also managing their crises and potentially taking on legal liability for Amanda's debts? That night I made a decision that felt both generous and foolish. I'd host a New Year's Eve gathering at the family house, create a celebration atmosphere, and use the occasion to have an honest conversation about money boundaries and what I could realistically continue to provide going forward. I spent $400 on champagne appetizers and decorations, money I couldn't really afford but hoped would create the right mood for difficult discussions. I had no idea I was planning my own family funeral, that the New Year's Eve party would become the night everything I'd built and sacrificed would finally explode in my face. New Year's Eve 2024 arrived cold and crisp in Cedar Park, with that particular kind of Texas winter air that makes everything feel sharp and clear. I'd spent the morning arranging champagne flutes and setting out appetizers I couldn't really afford, trying to create the perfect atmosphere for what I hoped would be a turning point in our family's financial dysfunction. The house looked festive with gold and silver decorations, and I'd even bought those fancy crackers with brie and fig jam that Amanda always posted about on Instagram. By 8 o'clock, the living room was full of extended family. Patricia Coleman and her husband James Patterson had driven over from their place near Lake Travis, and their daughter Emma was home from UT for winter break. Diana Martinez had made the trip up from San Antonio, bringing her famous tamales and the kind of no-nonsense attitude that came from raising 3 kids on a teacher's salary. The conversation flowed easily around football bowl games and New Year's resolutions, the comfortable chatter of people who'd known each other for decades. But underneath the festive surface, I could feel tension building like pressure in a storm system. Dad kept checking his phone, probably worried about job applications he'd submitted before the holidays. Mom was being overly cheerful in that brittle way that meant she was stressed about something. And Amanda kept fidgeting with her jewelry, the nervous energy of someone carrying a secret she wasn't sure she wanted to share. Around 10:30, with champagne making everyone relaxed and talkative, Amanda stood up from her spot on the couch and cleared her throat. She had that look she got when she was about to make an announcement, the same expression she'd worn when revealing each new business venture over the years. "Y'all, I want to share something exciting with everyone," she said, her voice carrying that breathless enthusiasm I'd heard so many times before. "I've been working on something that's going to change everything for our family. It's a fitness app that's going to revolutionize how people work out at home." Here we go, I thought, settling back in my chair to hear the latest version of Amanda's get-rich-quick dreams. But this pitch was more polished than usual, more detailed and confident. She'd clearly been practicing. The app is called Fit Home, and it's going to solve the biggest problem in home fitness, which is motivation and personalization. People buy equipment and never use it, or they start workout videos and quit after a week. But my app will use AI to create custom workouts based on your goals, your equipment, and your schedule. It'll have social features so you can work out with friends virtually, and it'll track your progress in ways that keep you engaged. The family listened with the kind of polite attention Amanda had always commanded, nodding and making encouraging sounds as she painted pictures of venture capital funding and national media attention. She'd done her research this time, throwing around terms like user acquisition and freemium models with the confidence of someone who'd watched a lot of YouTube videos about entrepreneurship. "I need about $40,000 to build the prototype and launch the marketing campaign," she concluded, looking around the room with bright eyes. "Once we get the initial users, the venture capital will follow, and then we're talking about real money. Life-changing money." The room was quiet for a moment, the kind of respectful silence that follows any big announcement. Then Patricia spoke up with genuine curiosity. "That sounds interesting, honey. Have you done any market research on existing fitness apps? I know there are quite a few out there already. Amanda waved her hand dismissively. Sure, there are other apps, but none of them have my unique approach. I'm not worried about competition because mine will be completely different. That's when I made my mistake. Drawing on my actual experience in Austin's tech scene, I asked the kinds of questions that investors and managers asked every day. What's your user acquisition strategy? Have you researched the failure rate for fitness apps? Do you have any coding experience or development partners lined up? Amanda's confident smile faltered slightly. I'm still working out some of the technical details, she said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. But the concept is solid, and that's what matters most at this stage. I pressed gently, trying to be helpful rather than critical. Amanda, I work in software development. Most successful apps require teams of engineers and months of testing. $40,000 might not be enough to build something that can compete with established platforms like Nike Training Club or Peloton. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Amanda's face flushed red, and her voice got sharp in a way that made everyone shift uncomfortably in their seats. I'm not going to share all the specifics here, Sarah. People steal ideas all the time, and I can't risk having my concept copied before I get it to market. Mom's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Don't ruin New Year's Eve with all your negativity, Sarah. Let your sister dream for once. Negativity, I felt something hot and angry rise in my chest. I was asking basic business questions, the same ones any investor would ask. But I could see from the faces around the room that I'd been cast in the familiar role of the dream crusher, the boring sister who rained on Amanda's parade. At 11:45, with Dick Clark's New Year's Rockin' Eve playing softly on the television and champagne, making everyone looser with their words, Amanda delivered the line that would change everything between us, forever. You know what your problem is, Sarah, she said, her voice loud enough to cut through all the other conversations in the room. You live such a boring, safe little life. Same job, same apartment, no risks, no vision. You're too scared to do anything extraordinary. And that's why you'll always be ordinary. The words hit me like a slap across the face. Around the room, I could see family members glancing at each other, uncomfortably sensing that we'd crossed from holiday tension into something much more serious. Emma looked mortified. Patricia's eyebrows were raised in disapproval, and Diana was shaking her head slightly. But what Amanda had just said was so fundamentally wrong, so completely opposite to reality, that it stripped away 7 years of patience and self-control in an instant. She was calling me boring and risk-averse, while I'd been bankrolling her parents' entire lifestyle and funding her endless string of failures with my own financial security. The countdown to 2025 began playing on television as I felt 7 years of suppressed rage crystallizing into perfect deadly clarity. Something snapped inside me like a wire stretched too tight. I stood up from my chair and walked to the center of that living room, past the champagne glasses and holiday decorations I'd paid for, past the family members who'd watched me sacrifice everything while praising Amanda for nothing. My voice cut through the party noise with a calmness that surprised even me. Y'all want to talk about taking risks? Let's talk about the risks I've been taking for 7 years. The room went dead silent. Amanda's mouth was still open from her insult, but no sound was coming out. Dad lowered his beer bottle slowly, and Mom's face went pale as she realized where this was heading. Amanda, you want to call me boring and safe. Let me tell you about risk. You've borrowed money from half this family and never paid back a cent. Remember the food truck that lasted 4 months? I paid for that. The jewelry business that ended up in your own closet. That was my money too. Every scheme, every failure, every shopping spree has been funded by the boring girl with the safe job. Patricia's eyes widened, and James leaned forward in his chair. Emma looked like she was watching a car accident in slow motion. Diana set down her champagne glass with a sharp clink against the coffee table. For 7 years I've been paying to keep this house standing. $1,200 monthly for the mortgage. $500 for utilities. $800 for car payments. $300 for insurance premiums. Add phones, internet, and every emergency that comes up, and that's $35,000 every single year. I heard Patricia suck in her breath and saw Diana's hand fly to cover her mouth. Emma was staring at me like she'd never seen me before, and James was shaking his head in disbelief. 7 years times $35,000. That's $245,000 I've handed over to keep this family afloat, while Amanda played entrepreneur with money she never earned and never paid back. The silence was so complete, I could hear the television in the background, crowds cheering in Times Square as midnight approached. Dad's face was turning red, that dangerous color it got when his pride was wounded. Mom looked like she was about to be sick. Amanda finally found her voice, though it came out as a squeak. "That's not fair, Sarah. We never asked you to keep track like that." "Never asked me to keep track," I laughed, and it sounded bitter even to my own ears. "You never asked me to keep track of $250,000. Amanda, 3 days ago, you asked me to co-sign $18,000 more in loans for debt. You racked up using my name as a reference." Now Patricia was looking at Amanda with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of shock and disappointment that made my sister shrink back into the couch cushions. "And now you want $40,000 more for another business idea that you haven't researched, haven't planned, and will abandon the minute it gets difficult, just like every other dream you've chased with other people's money." At 11:58, with 2 minutes left in 2024, Dad exploded from his chair like a volcano finally erupting. His fist came down on the coffee table so hard that champagne glasses jumped and Emma's phone slid onto the floor. "You don't belong here," he roared, his face purple with humiliated rage. His voice filled the room, drowning out the television and the sound of fireworks beginning to pop in distant neighborhoods. Mom leaned forward, her voice sharp as broken glass, and aimed directly at my heart. "You're just bitter about your sister. You always have been." The words should have hurt. For 7 years, they would have sent me running back to my apartment to cry and question whether I was a terrible daughter. But something had changed in me during those few minutes of truth-telling. I looked around at their faces at the shock and anger and embarrassment, and I felt nothing but cold clarity. Outside, the first New Year's fireworks were exploding in the distance as 2025 arrived, and I smiled with a calmness that seemed to terrify them more than screaming would have. Then let Amanda cover the $35,000 next year. The room went silent again, except for the sound of Dick Clark's voice on television announcing the new year. Patricia was staring at Dad with disgust. Diana was shaking her head slowly. James had his arm around Emma, who looked like she was about to cry. Mom's voice was shaking when she spoke. "Sarah, you're being unreasonable. We're family." "Family?" I picked up my purse from the side table and slung it over my shoulder. Family doesn't use one person as a bank account while treating her like hired help. Family doesn't dismiss 7 years of sacrifice and then ask for more money in the same breath. The countdown on television reached 0 as I walked toward the front door. Behind me, I could hear Amanda starting to cry and Mom calling my name, but their voices sounded like they were coming from underwater. As I stepped out into the cold Texas night, fireworks were blooming across the sky in celebration of new beginnings. I climbed into my Honda Civic, the car I'd bought with my own money and maintained with my own income, and drove away from the house I'd been paying for toward the apartment I'd been neglecting. For the first time in 7 years, their crisis wasn't mine to solve. The new year had arrived, and I was finally ready to find out what my life could look like when I stopped funding theirs. The drive through empty Austin streets at 12:30 on New Year's morning felt like traveling through a different world. My hands were steady on the steering wheel, despite everything that had just happened, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in 7 years: complete clarity about what I needed to do. The weight of their expectations, their guilt trips, their financial manipulation had lifted off my shoulders like fog burning away in sunlight. By 1 o'clock, I was sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open, methodically severing every financial connection that tied me to their dysfunction. The mortgage payment was first. 7 years of $1,200 monthly transfers from my Wells Fargo checking account, scheduled automatically for the first of every month like clockwork. I clicked into the online banking system and found the recurring payment screen. My finger hovered over the cancel button for just a moment. 7 years of conditioning told me I was being selfish, that I was abandoning people who needed me. But then I remembered Amanda's voice calling me boring, and ordinary, remembered Dad screaming that I didn't belong there, remembered Mom's accusation that I was just bitter and jealous. I clicked cancel. The confirmation screen appeared with cold, digital efficiency. Payment scheduled for January 1st has been canceled. Future automatic payments have been disabled. Account holder will be notified by email. The relief was immediate and physical, like setting down a weight I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten how much it hurt. But I wasn't finished. I opened a new browser tab and logged into the utility company's website, where I'd been the primary account holder and payment source for their electricity, water, gas, and trash pickup since 2017. One by one, I removed my credit card information from their systems and transferred the accounts back to David Coleman's name. I typed his email address into each notification field and hit submit, imagining his face when he woke up to a dozen emails informing him that he was now responsible for services he'd taken for granted for nearly a decade. The car loans required phone calls, but it was New Year's Day, and the dealership finance departments were closed. I made notes to call first thing Tuesday morning to remove myself from both vehicle financing agreements. In the meantime, I sent emails to both lenders informing them that I would no longer be making payments and requesting immediate transfer of responsibility to the primary owners. Next came the insurance policies. Auto homeowners health coverage for the entire family, all paid through automatic drafts from my account. I logged into each company's website and canceled the policies effective immediately, with 30-day written notices sent to all covered parties. Let them figure out their own coverage before they found themselves driving uninsured or losing their house to a claim they couldn't cover. The family cell phone plan felt almost personal to cancel. For years I'd been paying for Amanda's iPhone, with unlimited data, watching the monthly bills climb as she streamed videos and posted on social media, while I walked to work to save money. I changed the account password, removed every device except my own, and scheduled service termination for January 3rd. They'd have 72 hours to set up their own plans before their phones went dead. Internet and cable were next. I remembered all the times I'd driven over on weekends to find them binge-watching Netflix series or streaming sports while I worked on their honey-do lists. The Spectrum account was in my name, paid through my credit card, servicing a house I no longer lived in for people who just told me I didn't belong there. I logged in and scheduled service disconnection for January 2nd. No more high-speed internet, no more cable TV, no more streaming services. They could figure out their own entertainment options. The final cut was the most personal. 2 years ago, after a neighbor's house was burglarized, I'd spent $2,000 installing a comprehensive security system in their home. Cameras, motion sensors, smart locks. A doorbell camera, all connected through an app on my phone that let me monitor the property remotely. I opened the security app one last time and watched the live feed from their living room. The party had clearly ended badly. I could see champagne glasses scattered around decorations, askew evidence of the chaos I'd left behind. The Christmas tree lights were still twinkling, casting colored shadows on empty chairs, where extended family members had witnessed the explosion of 7 years of suppressed truth. I clicked into the system settings and found the account management screen. The cameras I'd paid for, the sensors I'd installed, the smart locks I'd programmed, all of it connected through my subscription and controlled through my devices. I scrolled down to the bottom of the settings panel and found what I was looking for. Deactivate all devices. Permanently delete account. The system warned me that this action couldn't be undone, that all recorded footage would be deleted, that the hardware would become permanently disconnected from monitoring services. I thought about the irony of it all. I'd installed this system to keep them safe, to protect the house I was paying for, to give myself peace of mind about their security. Now I was the threat they needed protection from. I was the one cutting off their safety net, their financial security, their comfortable lifestyle built on my sacrifice and their entitlement. I clicked confirm. One by one, the camera feeds went dark. The motion sensors stopped reporting. The smart thermostat disconnected. The doorbell camera went offline. Within minutes, the house that had been my responsibility for 7 years was finally completely no longer mine to manage or monitor. By 4 in the morning, I'd severed every financial tie that connected me to their household. No more mortgage payments, no more utilities, no more insurance, no more phones, no more internet, no more security. I'd given them exactly what Dad had screamed at me, what they'd all made clear they wanted. I was no longer part of their family, which meant I was no longer responsible for their bills. I closed the laptop and sat in the quiet of my Austin apartment, surrounded by furniture I'd bought myself and bills I could actually afford. For the first time in 7 years, every dollar in my bank account belonged to me. Every financial obligation was truly my own. Outside, the last of the New Year's fireworks were fading from the sky, and I could hear the distant sounds of a city settling down after celebration. Inside, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed: peace. I woke up January 1st to my phone, buzzing like an angry hornet beside my bed. 100 missed calls, 87 text messages, 15 voicemails. The notifications kept rolling in, even as I stared at the screen, trying to process the magnitude of their panic. The first voicemail was Mom's voice, high and frantic in a way I'd never heard before. "Sarah, honey, something's wrong with everything. The power went out around 6 this morning, the heat shut off, we can't get hot water, we can't even make coffee. Whatever you did, you need to fix it right now. Please call me back." Dad's voice came next, cold as January wind, but shaking with barely controlled rage. "Whatever game you think you're playing, it ends today. This is elder abuse, Sarah, and it's against the law. I'm calling our lawyer and the police. You have until noon to restore everything, or you're going to face serious consequences." For a moment, sitting there in my warm apartment with my functioning coffee maker and reliable electricity, I felt a stab of doubt. Had I gone too far? Were they right about this being some kind of abuse? The old Sarah, the people-pleaser who'd spent 7 years absorbing their guilt and manipulation, started rising up to take control. But then my phone buzzed with a text from an unexpected source. Mrs. Chen from next door had somehow gotten my number. "Honey, I've been watching you take care of that family for years while they treated you poorly. The police just left and told your parents this was a civil matter between adults. You did the right thing. Stay strong." I blinked at the message, reading it twice to make sure I wasn't imagining the validation from someone who'd witnessed everything. Mrs. Chen had watched me bring groceries every weekend, had seen me do their yard work, while Amanda lounged inside, had observed the fundamental unfairness of our family dynamic from her kitchen window. Before I could spiral into self-doubt, I called my cousin Kevin Coleman in Houston. Kevin was a personal injury lawyer who'd built a successful practice by being smarter than opposing counsel and tougher than insurance companies. If anyone could give me straight legal advice, it was him. Kevin answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the early hour. "Sarah, what's going on? I heard there was some kind of family drama last night." I explained everything. 7 years of payments. The New Year's Eve confrontation. My decision to cut all financial ties. Dad's threats about elder abuse and lawyers. Kevin listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he laughed so hard I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "Sarah, your daddy's bluffing harder than a poker player with nothing but a pair of twos. There's no law anywhere in Texas, or anywhere else for that matter, requiring adult children to financially support their parents. You were paying their bills voluntarily from your own accounts. You had every legal right to stop." The relief flooded through me like warm water. Kevin continued in his lawyer voice, the tone he used when he wanted to make sure clients understood important points. "Keep those payment records you mentioned. 7 years of documentation showing voluntary support is actually evidence in your favor. If anything, their expectation that you continue indefinitely while providing no gratitude or respect could be seen as financial exploitation. As we talked, I opened my laptop and logged into the security camera backup I'd saved before disconnecting the system. The feed showed police cars in their driveway, red and blue lights flashing in the gray morning light. But instead of the crime scene I'd expected, I saw something that looked more like a sitcom. Dad was pacing around the powerless living room in his bathrobe, gesturing wildly at two uniformed officers who looked more bored than concerned. Their body language screamed, "This is not our problem," as Dad pointed at papers and waved his arms dramatically. Mom sat wrapped in blankets on the couch, and Amanda stood by the window in pajamas, looking lost and confused. Kevin was still talking. "The police response tells you everything you need to know. If they thought you'd committed a crime, they'd be investigating, taking statements, possibly arresting someone. Instead, they're telling your parents this is a civil matter between adults who need to work out their own financial arrangements." I watched through the camera as the officers shook their heads, pointed toward their patrol car, and clearly prepared to leave. Dad followed them to the driveway, still talking animatedly, but the cops got in their car and drove away without looking back. "Sarah," Kevin said, his voice gentle, now instead of lawyerly, "I've watched your family dynamics for years at reunions and holidays. What you did took incredible courage. A lot of people in your situation never find the strength to break the cycle." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee that I could afford in an apartment I could pay for, surrounded by possessions that belonged to me rather than obligations that belonged to them. My phone kept buzzing with increasingly desperate messages from the Cedar Park house, but for the first time in 7 years, their emergency wasn't my emergency. Another text came in from Mrs. Chen. "Your parents are telling neighbors you had some kind of mental breakdown and abandoned them. I'm setting people straight. Everyone who's watched this family knows you were the one holding everything together." I realized I wasn't as alone as I'd felt. Mrs. Chen had witnessed their treatment of me from her front row seat next door. Kevin had observed the family dysfunction from a lawyer's perspective. Other people had seen what I'd been too close to recognize. The validation was overwhelming. For 7 years I'd questioned whether I was being dramatic, whether their treatment was normal, whether I owed them the support I was providing. But objective observers, people with no stake in the outcome, were telling me I'd been right to finally put myself first. As the day wore on and the messages continued pouring in, I felt something I hadn't experienced since college: the freedom to make plans that were entirely about my own future, my own happiness, my own financial security. The storm they'd created was no longer mine to weather. I was finally standing on solid ground, watching from a safe distance as they learned to manage the life they'd built on my sacrifice. Within 72 hours, the story of New Year's Eve had spread through Cedar Park like wildfire on dry grass. In a suburb where everyone knew everyone else's business, the sight of police cars in the Coleman driveway had been enough to start tongues wagging, and the truth that followed was more dramatic than anyone could have imagined. Mrs. Chen became my unlikely champion, approaching Patricia Coleman and James Patterson when they came to check on Dad and Mom that first weekend. I heard about this conversation later from Emma, who witnessed it from the front porch while her parents went inside to survey the damage. "I've been watching that girl sacrifice herself for this family for 7 years, Mrs. Chen told them, her retired teacher voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades managing difficult situations. "I've seen her bring groceries every Saturday, watched her do their yard work, while that younger one lounged inside with her shopping bags. They treated Sarah like hired help while spoiling Amanda rotten." Patricia had always been the family member most willing to speak uncomfortable truths, but even she was shocked by the full scope of what Mrs. Chen had observed. The elderly neighbor described watching me carry my parents' financial burdens while being dismissed, and overlooked watching Amanda's constant deliveries and new purchases while I drove the same worn-out car year after year. The extended family confrontation that followed was years overdue. Patricia and James sat down with Dad and Mom in their cold, powerless living room and delivered truths that had been festering since I was a child. "We've all seen how differently you treated those girls," Patricia told her brother, her voice steady but fierce. "Sarah gave up everything while you enabled Amanda's failures. Do you have any idea how much damage you've done to both your daughters?" Diana Martinez made the 3-hour drive from San Antonio specifically to confront Mom about the favoritism that had destroyed our family. She'd watched it at every holiday gathering, every family reunion, every celebration where Amanda was praised for existing, while my achievements were ignored. "I kept my mouth shut for too long," Diana told Mom, her voice shaking with years of suppressed anger. "But watching Sarah walk out that door was the proudest I've ever been of her. You chose favorites between your children and you chose wrong." James Patterson, usually the peacemaker in family disputes, was blunt in a way that shocked everyone. "Everyone knows Amanda owes money to half the family and never pays anyone back. We've all watched her spin one business scheme after another while Sarah built a real career. You enabled a user while punishing a giver, and now you're facing the consequences." Amanda tried to defend herself, spinning stories about misunderstanding and family jealousy, but the relatives who'd watched our family dynamic for decades weren't buying it anymore. Emma, home from UT and old enough to understand adult complexities, was particularly harsh in her assessment of her cousin's behavior. "Amanda, I've seen you borrow money from my parents and never mention paying it back. I've watched you treat Sarah like she owed you something just for being related. You're 26 years old and it's time to grow up." The social consequences rippled through our church community, where Mom had always presented herself as the perfect mother with 2 successful daughters. Pastor Williams started receiving calls from parishioners who'd witnessed the family dynamics over the years, and the whispered conversations after Sunday services were brutal. Amanda's attempt to gain sympathy on social media backfired spectacularly. She posted a long, dramatic story about my cruel abandonment of the family, painting herself as the victim of a sister's jealousy and mental breakdown. But the comments section became a nightmare for her as family friends and Cedar Park neighbors shared their own observations. "I remember when you borrowed $300 from me for your food truck and never paid it back," wrote one former high school classmate. "Sarah was always the responsible one. Maybe it's time you learned to be responsible too. Your sister paid for my son's car repair when we were struggling, and she barely knew us," added a neighbor. "She never asked for credit or thanks. You could learn something from her example." The Facebook drama escalated when Amanda's post was shared by people who added their own commentary about entitled young adults who'd never learned the value of work or gratitude. The story spread beyond Cedar Park into Austin's social circles, where people began recognizing Amanda as the girl whose sister had been supporting her parents while she played entrepreneur. Meanwhile, the practical consequences were mounting faster than they could handle. Amanda's debt collectors, no longer deterred by minimum payments scraped together from various sources, began calling the house directly and making threats about legal action and asset seizure. The calls came constantly throughout January, interrupting their attempts to restore basic services and adding another layer of stress to their already overwhelming situation. Dad's wounded pride, which had been the driving force behind his anger toward me, began cracking under the weight of public scrutiny and financial reality. The neighbors who'd once envied their apparent stability now whispered about their dysfunction. Mrs. Chen had made sure everyone on the street understood the real story, and the sympathy they'd expected was replaced by judgment about parents who'd exploited one daughter while spoiling another. By February, the perfect family facade Dad had maintained for decades lay in complete ruins. Church friends stopped calling. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Amanda's social media presence became a source of embarrassment rather than pride. The golden child who'd once been celebrated for her dreams and ambition was now known throughout Cedar Park as the spoiled daughter whose selfishness had destroyed her family's financial security. The responsible daughter who'd been taken for granted was being praised for finally standing up for herself. For the first time in my adult life, I had allies who were willing to speak publicly about what they'd witnessed. People were taking sides, and I was discovering that I hadn't been as alone or as wrong as I'd always believed. The community reckoning I'd never asked for was validating everything I'd felt but been too guilty to acknowledge. The truth was finally louder than their manipulation, and it was setting me free in ways I hadn't expected. The transformation that followed was more complete than I could have ever imagined when I walked out of that house on New Year's Eve. 6 months later, I was living in a downtown Austin condo with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lady Bird Lake, finally experiencing what financial freedom felt like when you weren't supporting an entire household of people who treated your generosity like an entitlement. The promotion Jennifer had mentioned came through in February 2025, along with a salary bump to $120,000 plus equity options that made me feel like a real player in Austin's booming tech scene. Without $35,000 annually disappearing into the Coleman family black hole, I was able to max out my retirement contributions, open investment accounts, and even hire a financial advisor who helped me understand how much wealth I could have built if I'd been investing that money instead of funding their lifestyle. The numbers were staggering when laid out in black and white. If I'd been investing $35,000 annually in index funds instead of paying their bills, I'd have had nearly $400,000 by now. The opportunity cost of my family loyalty was almost $500,000 in lost wealth, building money that could have set me up for early retirement or financial independence. But the most profound change wasn't financial. It was discovering what healthy relationships actually looked like. In March, I found Dr. Rebecca Thompson, a family therapist who specialized in adult children of dysfunctional families. Sitting in her comfortable office with plants and soft lighting, I finally heard someone with professional training validate everything I'd experienced. "You weren't responsible for their dysfunction, doctor," Thompson explained during one breakthrough session. "Healthy families don't require one member to sacrifice their future to maintain everyone else's comfort. What you experienced was financial exploitation disguised as family obligation." The support group she recommended became my sanctuary, a circle of people whose stories mirrored mine in painful detail. There was Jennifer, whose parents had expected her to fund their retirement while calling her selfish for wanting her own apartment. There was Marcus, whose siblings had borrowed over $60,000 for various emergencies and business ventures without ever repaying a cent. There was Linda, whose mother had guilt-tripped her into co-signing loans that destroyed her credit when the payments inevitably stopped. We met every Thursday evening in the basement of a Methodist church near downtown, sharing stories that validated experiences we'd been taught to minimize or ignore. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't the only person who understood what it felt like to be treated like a walking ATM by people who claimed to love you. Meanwhile, the consequences for my family continued mounting throughout 2025. They lost the Cedar Park house by June, their credit destroyed, and no family members willing to co-sign new loans after witnessing the New Year's Eve explosion. They moved into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment where Dad worked security shifts at a warehouse, and Mom added painful extra hours at the dental office to make ends meet. Amanda's fitness app dream died the quiet death that all her ventures eventually suffered once reality set in. Without family money to cushion her failures, she kept her retail job folding clothes and dealing with customers who didn't care about her entrepreneurial aspirations. The debt collectors finally caught up with her, garnishing her wages and making her face consequences she'd avoided for years through family bailouts. The most unexpected gift of this whole experience was meeting Michael Torres at a weekend conference in Chicago. He was an architect with kind eyes and emotional intelligence that made me realize how starved I'd been for genuine connection. When I told him my story during our third date, he reached across the table and said something that changed how I saw everything. "Sarah, that's not family. That's exploitation with a biological connection. Real family celebrates your success instead of treating it like their resource." As I finished telling this story from my beautiful condo surrounded by plants and artwork, I chose because they make me happy rather than because they were practical or affordable. I've learned the most important lesson of my adult life. You can't love people into treating you better, and you can't sacrifice your way into someone's genuine affection. The woman who once begged for scraps of recognition from people who saw her as a convenience has learned to build relationships where she's valued rather than used. I've discovered that real family isn't defined by DNA or obligation, but by who shows up for your joy as enthusiastically as they show up for your struggles. If you're dealing with family members who treat your generosity like their right, who guilt you for having boundaries, or who expect you to fund their poor choices while calling you selfish for wanting your own life, I want you to know something important. You're not responsible for fixing people who benefit from staying broken, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back and let them face the natural consequences of their decisions. Breaking free from toxic family dynamics is one of the hardest things you'll ever do, but it's also the most liberating. On the other side of that fear and guilt is a life where your worth isn't measured by what you can provide, where your achievements are celebrated instead of exploited, and where you finally get to discover who you are when you're not carrying everyone else's burdens. Have you ever had to set boundaries with family members who treated your love like a bank account? What gave you the strength to finally say enough? Share your story in the comments below, because these experiences connect us and remind us we're not alone in these struggles. And if this story resonated with your own journey toward freedom and self-respect, I'd be grateful if you'd like and subscribe for more stories about choosing yourself when everyone else expects you to choose them.